Welcome back to PS 113 Introduction to Psychology, Chapter 1 Introduction to Psychology. On the first lesson, a couple of the big ideas was the definition of psychology and goals of psychology. In this lesson, I want to go over old school psychology, how it got started in the early days, and then some descriptive research methods. Let's go. Psychology, in some form or another, has been around for thousands of years. It's nothing new. Religion has a lot to say about the nature of humanity. Philosophy has dealt with sensation, perception, emotion, and personality. Writers and artists, and we should listen to what they have to say, have unique insights into conflict, motivation, and the list goes on and on. But the science of psychology is relatively new. Wilhelm Wundt is generally credited with being the father of psychology by establishing the first laboratory at Leipzig University in Germany, 1879. Wundt and his associates carried out reaction time experiments, word association tests, and generally tried to break down conscious experience into its structural elements. Their approach, or school of psychology, is called structuralism. These early psychologists felt the new field should focus on breaking down the structure and elements of all conscious experience, including thoughts, feelings, and emotions. One of their main tools was called introspection, a scientific looking within at the inner workings of the mind. Now, there were big problems with that, and I'm going to explain with a personal story shortly. But a generation later, William James rose to prominence with a different view and is now known as the father of American psychology. James famously made the case that consciousness cannot be frozen in time and broken down for study into its constituent parts any more than you could try to define a river that is changing and evolving every second. James coined the term, and he's most famous for this, stream of consciousness, to underscore the nature of the mind as he saw it and the folly of trying to use introspection to catalog its components in the way a physicist might try to break down a molecule into its separate atoms. James and his colleagues' school of psychology came to be known as functionalism because they believe the emphasis of psychology should be on the function of the mind and not its structure. The early American psychologists were interested in the purpose of consciousness, and they reasoned that the ability to think and use language and solve problems must help us to survive and adapt somehow. Wundt and James schools died out in the early 1900s. Nobody is a structuralist today. Nobody is a functionalist today. It doesn't exist. But these different early approaches to psychology have influenced modern perspectives, and these modern perspectives will be coming up over and over as we go through this course. Now, let me discuss a problem with introspection as a research technique that the structuralist could never overcome, and I'm going to do this with a personal story, true story. Several years ago, I went hiking with some good friends over in the Guadalupe Mountains outside Carlsbad. And we camped out overnight, and the next day we trekked, it must have been up to 15 miles up and down mountains and through canyons. I got to confess, there were some moments when I didn't know if I was going to make it, but I did make it. I'm here. It was one of the most tiring and exhausting experiences of my life, but as you might imagine, there was a tremendous feeling of satisfaction afterwards. We got back into Carlsbad after midnight and had pizza, good pizza, But what I remember most was the Coke that I drank. It was the sweetest tasting and best Coke I've ever had in my life. Now, I told my buddies that the pizza place must have gone heavy on the syrup that day, but they said, "No, Walt, it's the same formula as it's always been. It just tasted like an ordinary Coke to them." So if I had to introspect and break down the taste of that Coke into its elements, there would have been a big difference of opinion between me and my fellow hikers. Can you think of some psychological reasons why that was an awesome Coke for me? And it still ranks highly today on my list of great Cokes. Well, I bet you can come up with some reasons. And that was the problem with introspection as a research tool. There was no way to account for individual differences in motivation and emotion, like what I was going through that night. Fortunately, psychology has come a long ways from its early reliance on introspection, and we have a variety of modern research techniques. Most research in our field is descriptive. It is not experimental. But people use the word experiment all the time to refer to any type of research. And strictly speaking, the experiment is in a special category all its own, and we're going to discuss that last in the chapter. But for now, we're going to look at naturalistic observation, the case study, and the survey method, and then I'll wrap it up. Do you believe that we can begin to do research on people simply by observing them in their environment without talking, interacting, or interfering in any way? Sure we can, if it's done scientifically. That's the key. This is called naturalistic observation, and you probably know it as people watching. Suppose we want to study who plays with who on the playground during recess in grade school. Do boys and girls play together, or do boys play with boys, and do girls seek each other out? That's a good question, isn't it? We would have to get permission from the school, explain specifically what we're going to observe out there and measure, the length of the study, and how we will be non-obtrusive. That's a key. Also, how to share final results and conclusions with the school, since they were kind enough to give us permission to do the study in the first place. That is an example of naturalistic observation. A second descriptive research approach is called the case study. A key to the case study is that we focus on just one subject, and there's usually something unusual or different about them that we want to learn more about. We might spend weeks or even months interviewing with the individual, as well as talking to others who know them well, gathering a social history, and even doing psychological testing. Some of the most fascinating case studies in psychology have been done on criminals who masterminded bizarre acts of violence and are presumed to be psychologically disturbed. The goal is to describe and explain what might have led that person to commit such horrific deeds. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember, this is Charles Manson, who's still alive and serving a life sentence in prison in California. More recently, this is Jared Loughner, who shot and killed a bunch of people at an outdoor event in a mall in Arizona, including a congresswoman. And most recently, James Holmes, who at a Batman premiere at a theater outside of Aurora, Colorado, killed a bunch of people dressed up as the Joker. It remains to be seen what we might learn, especially from these last two criminals, from a case study approach, assuming that they're even willing to participate. And we'll see. But that is the case study approach. A third descriptive research approach is the survey method. And the advantage to a survey is that we can obtain information quickly and cheaply. Suppose we want to study Americans' attitudes toward legalization of same-sex marriage. That's a big issue in the news these days. You might think that we would have to survey the entire population of our country to get a valid result, but we don't have to. We can rely on a sample. A properly drawn random sample of, say, 5,000 citizens may be all that's necessary to give us an accurate finding. Traditionally, researchers have conducted surveys by calling people on the telephone. Doing surveys online is quickly growing in popularity, and as you might imagine, it's pretty cheap. It's not very expensive to do at all. We've learned a great deal about adolescent drug use through the survey method. Much of what we know about human sexuality has also been gathered from survey data. But I got to give you a word of caution about surveys, and that's the issue of social desirability. Social desirability is a human tendency to want to make a favorable impression on others by saying and doing the right thing. And here's how it works. We Americans claim to believe in God and practice religion in our daily lives, don't we? But if researchers survey us on how often we go to church, do you think we're totally honest and accurate? Or do you think there is a tendency to over-report church attendance? I think you know the answer to that one. And that is the survey research method, keeping in mind the ideas of population, sample, and social desirability. Well, that's all for part 2. We'll see you on part 3 when we get into correlational method. Bye-bye.